The 80s were full of bold ideas from Australia's car industry. Every major manufacturer wanted the next big success, and buyers were spoiled for choice. New family sedans, practical hatchbacks, and hard-working utes filled showrooms from Perth to Brisbane. Some became legends that Australians still treasure today. Others promised far more than they ever delivered. A handful were let down by poor engineering, rushed development, or quality problems that damaged their reputation almost overnight. Today we're counting down the 10 dumbest Australian cars of the 1980s that were actually bad, and by the time we reach number 1, you'll see how one decision became one of the biggest automotive mistakes Australia has ever witnessed. 10. Holden Gemini RB, 1985 to 1987. The RB Gemini arrived in May 1985 as Holden's replacement for the long-running TF Gemini. Built at Holden's Acacia Ridge plant in Queensland, it was based on the Isuzu Gemini and offered a 1.5-litre four-cylinder engine driving the rear wheels. Holden hoped it would continue the Gemini's reputation as an affordable, reliable small car. On paper, it made sense. Fuel prices were still a concern, buyers wanted economical transport, and the Gemini badge already had loyal followers across Australia. The biggest problem was that it simply wasn't good enough. The new model felt underpowered compared with improving Japanese rivals, refinement hadn't moved forward as much as buyers expected, and sales fell dramatically. Within 2 years, Holden abandoned local Gemini production altogether. For Australians who had loved earlier Geminis, the RB was a disappointment rather than a disaster. It wasn't terrible to drive, but it lacked the spark that had made the original such a success. And if Holden thought that car struggled, the next one developed a reputation that became almost impossible to shake. 9. Holden JB Camira, 1982 to 1984. The Holden JB Camira was one of the most ambitious cars Holden had ever produced. Released in August 1982, it became Holden's first front-wheel drive passenger car and was part of General Motors' worldwide J-Car program. It even won the prestigious Wheels Car of the Year award shortly after launch. Initially, buyers loved it. The spacious cabin, modern layout, and efficient 1.6-litre overhead cam engine made it feel years ahead of many older Australian designs. Then the problem started. Most people don't realize the Camira's downfall wasn't its concept. It was quality. Poor build consistency, overheating issues, electrical faults, and reliability complaints quickly destroyed public confidence. Holden had created an innovative family car, but owners found themselves making far too many trips back to the dealer. The saddest part is that the Camira actually drove well when everything worked properly. Even today, motoring historians often say it deserved a much better build quality than it received. But Holden wasn't the only manufacturer to produce a car that promised much more than it delivered. Nissan Pulsar Vector Sedan, 1987 to 1989. During the late 1980s, Nissan Australia wanted a stronger position in the family car market. The locally assembled Pulsar Vector Sedan was marketed as practical, economical, and well-equipped. Powered by reliable four-cylinder engines, it offered sensible running costs and modern styling for growing families. There wasn't anything dramatically wrong with the car itself. Its problem was identity. Australian buyers struggled to understand where it fitted. It was caught between cheaper small cars and larger family sedans like the Commodore and Falcon. While mechanically dependable, it never gave people a compelling reason to choose it over better established competitors. Few remember how quickly it faded from Australian roads. Unlike cars that developed loyal followings, the Vector simply disappeared from public memory. That's sometimes worse than being hated. We're only 3 cars into the countdown, and from here the mistakes become far more expensive for Australia's manufacturers. 7. Mitsubishi Sigma GN, 1985 to 1987. By the mid-1980s, the Sigma had already been a familiar Australian sight for years. Built at Mitsubishi's Tonsley Park plant in South Australia, the updated GN Sigma continued with the dependable Astron 4-cylinder engine and roomy interior that had made earlier models popular. Families appreciated the comfortable ride. Taxi operators valued the generous cabin. It looked like safe, sensible motoring. Here's the detail most people miss. By 1985, the Sigma was already feeling old. New competitors from Japan offered better refinement, more modern styling, and improved fuel efficiency. Mitsubishi was investing heavily in its replacement, the Magna, leaving the Sigma looking like yesterday's car before its time was over. Owners rarely described the Sigma as exciting. It simply did its job until the Magna arrived and showed everyone how quickly Australian family cars were evolving. And from this point on, the countdown takes a much more dramatic turn, because the next cars weren't just disappointing, they became symbols of decisions that Australian manufacturers would regret for years. 6. Holden VK Commodore, 1984 to 1986. The VK Commodore arrived in February 1984, looking sharper, more modern, and far more sophisticated than the model it replaced. Built at Holden's Elizabeth plant in South Australia, it offered everything from the dependable 3.3-litre Blue 6 to the fuel-injected 5.0-litre V8. Holden even introduced an electronic dashboard on some versions, something that felt incredibly futuristic in the mid-1980s. Australians loved the idea. Here was a locally built family car that looked modern and promised better performance and technology. But here's what many people forget. The electronic dashboard, while impressive in the showroom, quickly gained a reputation for faults as the cars aged. Digital displays could fail, warning lights became unreliable, and electrical gremlins frustrated owners. It wasn't enough to ruin every VK, but it certainly dented confidence in technology that many buyers weren't yet ready to trust. The mechanical parts were generally solid, yet owners often found themselves chasing electrical problems instead of simply enjoying the drive. We're halfway through the countdown, and from here the mistakes become much harder for Australia's car makers to explain. 5. Ford XF Falcon Panel Van, 1984 to 1988. The XF Falcon was one of Ford Australia's biggest success stories. Built at Broadmeadows in Victoria, it became a favourite with tradespeople, delivery drivers, and small businesses. The panel van version offered enormous cargo space and the proven 4.1-litre cross-flow inline-six that seemed capable of running forever. It wasn't performance that let it down, it was timing. Most people don't realize the XF was still using leaf springs and a platform that was beginning to show its age, while competitors were moving toward more modern designs. The steering felt heavy, refinement lagged behind newer rivals, and fuel economy wasn't particularly impressive by the late 1980s. Owners appreciated its toughness, but many also accepted that it was becoming an old-fashioned vehicle in a rapidly changing market. If you've ever driven one, you'll probably remember the heavy doors, the broad bonnet stretching ahead, and the unmistakable hum of the cross-flow 6 on the highway. But the next car made a much bigger mistake because it arrived with enormous expectations. 4. Holden JB Camira, 1987 to 1989. By the time the JB Camira appeared in 1987, Holden knew it had a reputation to repair. The company fitted a more capable 2.0-litre Family 2 engine, improved the suspension, and worked hard to address many of the quality issues that had plagued the earlier JB and JD models. On paper, it was easily the best Camira ever built. The tragedy was that hardly anyone cared anymore. The Camira name had already become associated with breakdowns and poor reliability. Even though the JE was genuinely improved, buyers had lost confidence. Showrooms found it increasingly difficult to convince customers that this version was different. Few remember how much better the JE actually was than its predecessors. It handled well, rode comfortably, and finally delivered much of what Holden had promised 5 years earlier. Unfortunately, reputations are much harder to rebuild than cars. Only 3 cars remain, and the next one became one of the biggest symbols of a manufacturer getting its market completely wrong. 3. Nissan Skyline R31 Ti, 1986 to 1987, Australian production. By the mid-1980s, Nissan Australia wanted to challenge Holden and Ford head-on. The locally built R31 Skyline rolled out of the Clayton plant in Victoria, bringing a level of sophistication Australian buyers weren't used to seeing in a family sedan. Independent rear suspension on many models, fuel-injected 6-cylinder engines, and European-inspired styling made it look like the future. It sounded like exactly what Australia needed. The problem was that it didn't feel like the Falcon or Commodore buyers were used to. Steering was lighter, the suspension felt different, and, despite being technically advanced, it struggled to convince traditional Australian buyers that it was tough enough for local conditions. Here's a detail most people miss. The Skyline wasn't really a bad car. In many ways, it was ahead of its time. The mistake was trying to sell an advanced Japanese-designed sedan into a market that still preferred simple, rugged Australian 6-cylinder cars. Owners who gave it a chance often became loyal fans. Everyone else simply walked past it in the showroom. Only 2 cars remain, and the next one became one of the most famous disappointments in Holden history. 2. Holden VL Commodore, 3.0-litre RB30, 1986 to 1988. The VL Commodore was a major turning point for Holden. Released in 1986, it replaced Holden's long-serving six-cylinder engine with Nissan's RB30e 3.0-litre fuel-injected straight-six to meet new unleaded fuel requirements. Built at Elizabeth in South Australia, it was smoother, more refined, and more economical than the engine it replaced. On paper, it looked like a brilliant solution, but many loyal Holden buyers couldn't accept opening the bonnet and finding a Nissan engine sitting where a Holden motor was expected. That single decision divided Australian car enthusiasts for decades. Mechanically, the RB30 proved to be one of the strongest six-cylinder engines ever fitted to a Commodore. The real problem wasn't reliability, it was identity. For thousands of Australians, a Holden powered by a Nissan engine simply didn't feel like a proper Holden, no matter how well it actually performed. Even today, the debate continues, but if you think that caused controversy, the number one car made an even bigger mistake, one that destroyed buyer confidence almost overnight. 1. Holden Camira, JB, 1982 to 1984. The number one spot belongs to the Holden JB Camira. When Holden unveiled the Camira in 1982, expectations couldn't have been higher. It was the company's first front-wheel drive family car, based on General Motors' global J-Car platform, and it won Wheels Car of the Year almost immediately. Holden believed it represented the future of Australian motoring. Unfortunately, reality turned out very differently. Owners soon began reporting overheating, oil leaks, transmission problems, electrical faults, and inconsistent build quality. Dealers struggled to keep up with warranty repairs, and public confidence disappeared at remarkable speed. What should have been Holden's most important new model became one of its biggest public relations disasters. The tragedy is that the concept itself wasn't flawed. The Camira offered excellent interior space, modern front-wheel drive packaging, and genuinely pleasant road manners. Had the quality matched the engineering, it might have changed Holden's future. Instead, it became the car many Australians still mention first whenever the conversation turns to disappointing local vehicles. Looking back today, these cars tell an important story. None of them were built with the intention of failing. They reflected the pressures facing Australia's manufacturers during one of the most competitive decades in our automotive history. Some were outdated too quickly, others suffered from rushed development, and a few simply arrived at the wrong time. Despite their shortcomings, they remain part of Australia's motoring heritage, and that's exactly why we still talk about them decades later. Which of these cars do you think deserve the number one spot? Or is there another Australian car from the 1980s that should have made the list? Let me know in the comments below. I read every comment. And if you enjoyed this countdown, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome, and I'll see you in the next one.